Okay, welcome to week one. This week we're going to be diving into Eugene Thacker's Tentacles Longer Than Night and talking a little bit about Lovecraft's biography and his cultural standing. If you haven't already, double check and post here on our introduction form. Again, these are really brief. This could be a few sentences or a paragraph. It's really just for us to get a sense of who we're working with in the next few weeks. Through the week, you're going to be taking a look at our readings here under Supernatural Horror Crash Course in Grounding. Quite rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? First things first, I think the order that I have them listed here will be the best for you. Thacker is a shorter reading. It's philosophy, but it's pretty accessible. Lovecraft's Selected Letters is a longer document. Some of the letters are cut off. If you're reading halfway through a letter and it just ends, that means you shouldn't be reading that letter. I really tried to just pick a few over the course of his life that help you understand best who he was. So the earlier letters are going to be about him as a child and his really, really, really bad poetry. And then we're going to move on into his worldview, his writing circle, and the really weird writing game that he plays with his friends. And then finally into the death of his mother and his writing career. And his friendship, I've included letters that highlight his friendship with fellow horror writer Clark Ashton Smith. If you haven't read Clark Ashton Smith, that's fine. I didn't know about him until I started reading Lovecraft a little more closely. He's fantastic, totally different, more fantasy driven. So if you're interested, definitely check him out. But with that said, I'm going to just jump into my lecture. This lecture every week will happen in the mornings, will be posted up on Monday. I will start probably with an overview and response to your posts and the class posts. This week, since it's the first, we don't have that. The format will be the same as we go forward, where I will be trying my darndest to really be transparent here. So I outline what my goals are, or what I think the major takeaways are from each lecture. And by the end of the time that I'm done talking at the camera, you should be able to walk away and feel comfortable going into the readings for the week. Heads up, the lecture will spoil material. So if you don't like spoilers, I'm sorry. It's just the way we have to handle things on an online course, so I hope that's okay. I'm not spoiling anything major when I say that the narrator of Dagon decides to jump out of a window. I'll just get it out of the way right now. So with that said, the goals of this lecture are to really familiarize you with the major events in Lovecraft's life, and really focusing in on how you can use his biography, the brief biography that I'm going to give you at the end of this, and the supplementary letters that I have posted for you to read, to really help you understand how he writes and why he writes the way he does and the fiction that he does. You're also going to be, in this lecture, understanding the power of horror and what it means for us as readers, viewers, and video game players, and what it means for us and our preoccupations and worries. This is Thacker 101. And then finally, by the end of this week and this lecture, you should begin to refine your critical viewing and reading skills. So you're going to be watching a short documentary on Lovecraft's life that covers all the biographical detail that I can't go into depth here for sake of time, and has some really awesome interviews from filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro, writers like Neil Gaiman, and their responses to Lovecraft's work. I'm interested, as we go into week 2, as a side note here, how you think some of those contemporary writers are responding to the problems of Lovecraft's politics and worldviews, which, as you make your way through his letters, you'll get a sense of. But that's just a side note. This lecture is going to be a horror crash course. That's why it's titled the way it is. I'm really picking Thacker's shorter book. We're only reading the introduction, so we can really play with some terminology. So before getting in, I do want to go over a few key terms. Horror is allegory. I'm ripping this right from pages 15 through 16 on Thacker's text. So double check if there's one thing that you read more than once, it's those few pages. And I break that down in the lecture here too. The other thing that we're going to be wrestling with this week may be unfamiliar to some of you who are not steeped in like English traditional reading practice, and that's the image of the unreliable narrator. Really, what an unreliable narrator is someone who is telling a story to us, the reader or the viewer, which is a narrator, right? However, there's something about them that makes us think they're dishonest or they're not stable. This may be, in Dagon, for example, a form of mental illness. Most of Lovecraft's narrators, as you will find out, open up within the first page and go, you know, I've seen some really crazy things, and Arkham Asylum looks great right now. Well, you already know two things. One, they've seen things that are atypical of a human being to see, and two, they're spending time in an asylum, which means we have to question what they're doing. Thacker brings up, right in the first few pages, Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat. I think that's a good example of unpacking the unreliable narrator. This also happens in regular fiction, not just horror. So Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Huck Finn is a liar. He comes out and says, I'm a liar. He's also a child who gets basic math wrong in the first few pages of the text. So anytime these characters who are narrating through a first-person lens kind of trip over facts, or they kind of shuffle away from details, or they give you any sort of inkling that they are not quite stable, they're in the realm of unreliable narrator. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield does the same thing. I'm looking for the world without phonies. Oh, by the way, I'm a terrible liar. But here, listen to everything that I have to say for about 200 pages. As a reader, you're kind of lost in the swirl of that. So you're constantly then reading and going, okay, what is truth, what is not? And we'll understand why that's really important, especially in Thacker's lens, as we go through this course, right? This idea that if we can't even understand the narrator and say, yeah, I 100% follow what he's saying and it has to be truthful, maybe there's something to the unreliable narrator that then links to the overall message of horror, right? And Thacker's movements of horror telling us about ourselves or leaving us in that tension point. Get to that in a second. The other one that's going to come up a lot is speculative and weird fiction. I just ripped, I'm not going to read it verbatim for time, but I just ripped the definition of speculative fiction from an Oxford encyclopedia. Encyclopedia. It's still early, y'all. So definitely take a look at that definition and see how it relates. Really, it's any genre of writing, horror or fantasy or sci-fi, that deals with the strange and odd happening in everyday life. Less about the technical sci-fi things and more about us wrestling with strangeness, in short. So this is going to be key going forward in lectures. Your posts, I will always in my lectures highlight potential post topics that you can do. So throughout this, anything in green, Lovecraftian green, you can go after for your post. This is sometimes a close reading. This is sometimes a larger, broader question that will help you later as you start writing that longer paper. This is a way for you to unpack major questions for that week's readings. So I'm not going to go over these in lecture. You can take a look at this document when I post this video, and then post my lecture notes, so you can really see which one of these green texts you want to use for your 700-word post. Okay? So let's jump right into Thacker. I hope you guys enjoy him. He's pretty straightforward and easy to read, I think. I really love his personal narrative about how he came to horror. I'm sorry, my dog just decided to come right next to me and lay down. So if you hear any snoring, it's him. I'm boring him to death. So to get back into Thacker, we're only reading the introduction of a larger text, and this is good, I think, for us, because this allows us to see his whole methodology evolve. Thacker is a philosopher by trade, but also a horror buff. This introduction then seeks to unite both fields, right? His whole text wants to say that horror can be a form of philosophy. So instead of just saying how using philosophy to understand horror or philosophical trends to understand horror, Thacker is saying horror is and of itself a philosophy. And he kind of wants to test that thesis throughout. It's a fantastic book if you are interested. It's pretty cheap, too. So if you like his writing already, after this class, go ahead, pick them up. It's a lot of fun. The next chapter is on demons. So his main thing is saying, let's not just overlay theory on top of horror, but how horror can work as theory. And I have an example here to help you through that. So instead of saying how Freud's notion of the uncanny operates in something like Poe's William Wilson, doing a one-to-one comparison, he wants to say that, well, wait a minute, hold up. Maybe William Wilson is doing something similar to Freud's uncanny, as it predated it, but also expanding on it. So the fact that text, that horror text, can somehow in some way be a philosophical exploration and theory itself. So this is a huge concept. I want to break this down a bit. So he focuses in on a tension point, and I'll continue referring to this as a tension point. That happens whenever we view something horrific or read something horrific. And I'll read his quote here. The fork in the road is not simply between something existing or not existing. It is a wavering between two types of radical uncertainty. Either demons do not exist, but then my own senses are unreliable, or demons do exist, but the world is not as I thought it was. Okay, so he's using the example of demons. Let's kind of put a real-world example on this. So if during this lecture, your screen started flickering with a picture of a young, black-haired Japanese, almost Caucasian woman who has crawled out a well and is slowly walking towards you through your soft, warm, glowing computer screen, you see that, but your talented and expertly narrated teacher doesn't make any sort of mention towards it. You are left with a choice. You either acknowledge the fact that Samara is crawling towards you. This is the ring, for those of you that haven't caught on. So you either acknowledge that the girl is a figment of my imagination, which then makes you uncomfortable because that means you're unstable or unreliable. My own senses are unreliable, coming from Thacker's words. Or B, the demon ring girl actually exists and is indeed coming after you, which then means the supernatural exists, which also means that the natural order of your life as you know it is bunk. Or is upset in some way, shape, or form. In both cases, you're in discomfort, right? Either you're insane, or you have a condition that allows you to see this demon girl come crawling through your computer screen, or you're not, and everything that you know up until this point has been wrong. So this is the tension that he highlights. Either you're wrong about yourself, or you're wrong about the way in which you knew the world to work. So cool. What's the point? Well, for Thacker, it is the moment in which you're caught in making a decision. Of that moment of decision. I'm crazy, or the demon girl actually exists. That moment between those two realities is where the true power of horror lies. Take a look at the quote that I have here. Only in that brief moment of absolute uncertainty, when both options seem equally plausible and implausible, when neither thought can be accepted or rejected, when anything can be explained and nothing can be explained, only in that moment do we really have this horror philosophy, this questioning of the principle of sufficient reason. So how many of you know, and I'm guessing a lot of you know, the thought experiment of Schrodinger's cat? This is the kind of ethically dubious thought experiment where the cat is placed into a box with a radioactive material that'll decay out of its case, releasing radiation and either killing the cat or not, right? That's a horrible English PhD's summation of Schrodinger's cat. But the big thing here is the cat is both alive and dead in the box, right? It remains in a state of flux of both being and not being. Either the cat is alive or the cat is dead. Horror, for Thacker, truly, truly fantastic horror, lives in these moments. Like these moments between where you're looking at the box going, am I going to open it? Is there going to be a dead cat? Or is it going to be a cute kitty that's fine? That moment of possibility, the hap, is what's really powerful for horror. Well, why? It's those moments that he says we can start unpacking how we even think about the world around us. So I'm jumping down through the quote here. Perhaps genres such as horror are interesting. We're hopefully all in agreement on that. Not because we can devise ingenious exploratory models for them, right? But because they cause us to question some of our most basic assumptions about the knowledge production process itself, or about the hubris, and this is big, the hubris of living in a human-centric world in which we currently live. So the italics is my emphasis. So horror then, just like Schrodinger's cat, makes us try to unpack the possibility, the moment of possibility of being both alive and dead in the box. But that also makes us reevaluate the ways in which we understand something, right? Horror, especially the work of speculative fiction, then becomes a mirror not only for what preoccupies our subconscious and conscious thoughts, it does do that, but also a way to interrogate how we form those thoughts in the first place. So it functions as a philosophical checks and balances in my reading of Thacker, where by saying if the demon girl exists and the world as I know it is wrong, that means everything that I've learned up to this point is wrong. Or the demon girl doesn't exist, she's a figment of my imagination, and everything I know about myself is wrong. Well, how do I then know anything about myself? How do I begin to ask questions about the world around me? How did I determine this flawed position in either case? Those last two questions are huge for Thacker, and as we'll see, really big for Lovecraft. He seems to embody this. In short, horror makes us ask questions that upset our sense of being, undoing the questions themselves in the process. So if you're at the end of that thought experiment going, who am I? What am I doing? Why did I put a cat in a box? That's good. That's the goal. You're being critical of your own standing. And the reason why Thacker would argue you're being critical of that own experience, or of your own experience, is because you were put in that situation of tension between cat is alive, cat is dead. Ring girl is real or a product of my imagination. So this is absolutely foundational to where we're going. This tension point. You got a longer post there. So this is where Thacker puts away the academic for a second and decides to get personal. This is where he starts unpacking why horror. I think this is a great first-person narrative about how he came to horror and started reading trash horror fiction. My fun question is, do you think it's reliable? Why or why not? That may be a critique on academics as a whole. So the big thing for him, though, is that in this narration is that horror doesn't come from what you see. When we see something horrific, it's terrifying, don't get me wrong. If Samara immediately started crawling up from my computer screen, I would be scared. But then it's real, right? Once I see it, I can start digesting it. However, the real terror comes from what I can't see. And even beyond that, what I can't think. So seeing Samara, seeing the material version of Samara coming from my computer screen, well enough and good. Oh boy, there's a girl coming from my computer screen. But then that also makes me think of how the hell does that happen? How, in this world that as I know it, can Samara come through the physical screen? This is Lovecraft in a shell. In a nutshell. You're reading, or you will read, Dagon by this point. It's not just a matter of not seeing something for that narrator, but what he can't even understand. And because of that inability to understand, is what causes his fleshy little human brain to break. So I'm really interested in that tension point as Thacker outlines it. And I think going forward, we're going to continue reverting back to that and discussing that. So in this way, horror becomes both, this is where it gets a little tricky, allegorically and intimately connected with our lives. Check out page 15, and I want to really stress that you go back to that page and read it over. He argues kind of convolutedly here, so I tried to break it down a little easier for us. Horror functions both as something that represents an element in our lives, what he'll call material, but also engages in a reflective sort of way that makes those elements more understandable and real for us. A lot of gobbledygook, but let's break it down. I have 3 parts. So horror literally challenges us on a literal level, by its content. It stops us in our tracks, is what he says. We can objectively say, oh, hey, look, there's a fish man. Isn't he pretty? That fish man is in my material world, and he is a material girl. We can look at that and say, oh, look, a scaly fish monster is clutching the monolith. This is from Dagon. My precious worldview that did not include such scaly fish monsters is now shattered. Let's dance and laugh. So this is big. We watch the material object come through, the horrifying thing, and we go, ha, that's scary, but it's very real. See, this is what he means by material, that it's real, that we can touch it, that the thing of fantastical horror is now something that I can prod. Because of that questioning, at the end of that, because of that prodding, we're allowed to go, how did Fishman come here? We move into a more allegorical space, where we can kind of move away from just the narrator. So again, staying with Dagon, what, my dear unreliable narrator, can a scaly fish monster mean for me or humanity? What does it represent, I wonder, as you then fall babbling to the ground? So you're allowed to ask those questions then, right? You see the real thing, you then remove yourself ever so slightly and say, okay, but what does that monster mean? So this is really good to do with zombies. And if you are fans of zombies, this is fantastic. So you have a lynching at the end of the Night of the Living Dead. So what do the zombies represent? What's the real horror at the end of that movie when we're forced to watch humanity kill our protagonist in such a brutal fashion? And what is that linking to? Well, the obvious thing is racial politics and segregation, right? In that way, what's more horrifying, the monster or the ending of the film where a human sheriff decides to murder our hero who battled the undead hordes? Same thing later when zombies are made zombies from a nuclear blast. What is it about world annihilation and nuclear terror that somehow makes us uncomfortable, and that feeling can be adequately represented by the image of the zombie, or the more current, The Walking Dead. So in The Walking Dead, where The Walking Dead is not the zombie, it's the people that are alive. I know that's the bare bones reading that's on every message board. But the idea that horror can tell us more about what and who we are and how we form these beliefs. The monster can tell us more about who we are, is what I meant to say there. So in this case, the zombie then represents more primal nature in us, what we don't really like talking about. So in this way, we move from material, shambling corpse, or scaly fish monster, Samara coming from my screen, and then we start asking larger allegorical questions. What does that monster mean? Why does that keep happening? But then he goes on to a deeper level, and this is where it gets really meta, right? As readers, viewers, and people who wrestle with horror, we also then work with and try to understand the entire genre. So this reminds me, when we were reading Dagon, this may remind me of the scaly fish monster that comes from the creature of the Black Lagoon, which automatically makes me think of Guillermo del Toro's latest film, The Shape of Water. And that makes us ask questions if there is a genetic link between Lovecraft to Black Lagoon, from Black Lagoon to Shape of Water, from Shape of Water back to Lovecraft. And this sort of through line that we can trace through the genre, and Thacker highlights nods. So this is why everybody knows the slasher sounds from Psycho. Well, because that's a nod, or the camera views, or birds in Get Out, and predatory animals. So these sort of nods to the genre also help us understand the power of horror to make us understand ourselves or unpack who we are. So if we ask those questions, then maybe we can understand more about why we're so preoccupied with, say, fishmen who steal women and or drive American men insane and bestially self-destructive. So this is something, a really, really bare bones example that I think helps us unpack what Thacker's doing. So that last point is what I want to focus in on for this course, and what I really want you to take away here before we move into Lovecraft's biography. We know that Lovecraft's work is alluded to often in modern-day horror. Video games, posters, there was, I think, every year, a presidential campaign for Cthulhu, and it's like Cthulhu 2016, the lesser of all evils. And it's tongue-in-cheek, but that's not Lovecraft, right? I mean, it's different from the beast that we're going to read about in a few weeks, and yet we're using it. So we know that Lovecraft's work is alluded to, borrowed, reinterpreted, and reformed, but I'm more interested in understanding why his work can do this. What about that work makes us so, sometimes unknowingly, apt to reproduce the work of some reclusive, racist SOB from Rhode Island? And so this really makes me think, and why I gave you Thacker is because it's tied up in those questions, that tripartite breakdown of those questions of viewing the material object, going, okay, what does that mean? And then moving from that and going, okay, what does that tell me about the horror genre, and then us as a whole, as a collection of species. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Thacker. We're going to keep referring back to him. I'll allude to his work through lectures. If you have any qualms, queries, protestations, dear God, whys about Thacker, please don't hesitate to bring those up in your post. I will gladly clarify when possible. Again, if you need any help, shoot me an email and I'll do my best. Okay, so that was a lot in a rather short amount of time, and I'm sorry to continue to do so. But we're moving on to Lovecraft's life and letters. Whoa. His letters are a hoot. Very few children write letters on Thanksgiving that open up with a poem that says pretty much, "Mom, leave me alone in my room." So we already, through these letters, it's kind of funny to read. He's kind of playful. He's also a terrible human being in some of the letters. But I think you should be able to piece together some of his personality. But in order to do that, I want to kind of go over his life. And this is where the film will help you the most. I'm just giving you the short version. So without further ado, Lovecraft was born at the end of the 19th century in 1898. This is the same year that his father, who has the cool name of Winfield Scott Lovecraft, died in a sanitarium from neurosyphilis after a complete nervous breakdown. I want to just pause there for a second because this might be an important image. His father died the first year of his life from a nervous breakdown, was admitted to a sanitarium, and died of neurosyphilis. Maybe this might color the rest of his life in some of his narrators. As a result, Winfield's wife, Sarah Susan Lovecraft, Howard Phillips' mother, sheltered young Lovecraft. Fun side note, his nickname growing up was Little Sunshine. Again, I'm going to leave you with that. Growing up, Lovecraft, though sheltered by his mom, and the documentary goes into a few more details here that I think are actually quite heartwarming and cute, if not a little disturbing. He was really preoccupied with science, but was falling behind in school when he would go to school because he was always going out for mysterious illnesses. Now, current research, and it's hard to do this without being anachronistic, says that he could have been an early sufferer of depression and like bipolar depression, because throughout his life he did have moments of mania and sort of really manic depressive behavior. This could also be a Munchausen by proxy case, which is where, in this case, Lovecraft's mother would want to shelter and protect him, and feign illness to keep him fragile and thus reliant upon her. I'm not a fan of that reading because I don't think it does a lot of justice to Sarah Susan Lovecraft, but I'm just giving you the overview of how critics usually view his life. We read in his letters some of his absolutely terrible but charming poetry. Again, that first poem. And his early views of humans and faith. He was pretty much through his life an agnostic, arguing at times for complete atheism and then other times not. It usually boils down to there's not a Abrahamic conception of God where humans are faulty and we can't know the divine in its complete. But moving beyond that even a little more and saying that there's just some universal thing in which humanity is but a microscopic dot, which means we can't understand it. That sounds familiar, right? He also made friends, I don't know how, predominantly through his letters. Heads up on that strange letter writing game. If any of you play that with your friends, rock on. This group is important for him because they would serve as his literary circle. He would follow and shop his work with these people. And as you will know by the end of the documentary, his work was disseminated by these people in little weird magazines. So up until this point, I have here that in 1917 Dagon was published. That was one of his favorite stories. These were published not in like book form. These were published in like dime novels, collections, weird fiction magazines, pulp fiction, so little tiny comic books with short stories. This is the extent of his writing and where it's getting out. So I don't want you to go into this thinking that he was always writing these great stories and then he was well received in his life. He wasn't. We also find out that he tried to join the army during the Great War, so World War One. Tie this also to his dream that happens in the Civil War. I think it's fascinating. There's a trend of American writers who want to prove their masculinity and go off to the war effort. Faulkner did it too. And they always usually get kicked out or aren't able to enlist in H.P. Lovecraft's case. And he kind of resents that, not being able to prove himself or belong to a group, not be one of the boys, if I have to be so blunt. Big other event that happened in 1921 was his mom died. This is big too because his mom died in a sanitarium like his father after a major nervous breakdown. This greatly affected H.P. Lovecraft. In fact, he was never one for entertaining the idea of suicide up until this point. And as you read in his letters, he goes, "What is the point of living? I don't understand." So I want to highlight these two deaths. He had other deaths in his life, of course, but Sarah Lovecraft and his father dying of neuroses, of some form of nervous breakdown, and we won't get clearer than that because medical science wasn't the best in the 20s. These deaths color his writing, and you see it everywhere. From his inability to paint female characters adequately, you'll notice that as we go through, they're very rare, few and far between, and if they are, they're in this weird maternal sense. The other is the specter of mental illness and nerves. I'm really interested to see what you make of this, especially after reading Dagon. So one of your posts there. Shortly after her death, I think about 3 years later, in 1924, he marries Sonya Green. This is kind of radical for Lovecraft because Sonya Green is a Jewish Russian woman who challenges a lot of his earlier xenophobic beliefs. They moved together into New York. P.S. He hates it because it's really diverse, and he moved in during a heat wave, so who wouldn't? But Sonya really tried, it seems, to work down some of his xenophobia, but to no end. 5 years later, they're divorced. She moves out to Ohio. She's like, "Hey, Howard, come with me." And he's like, "No, I love Providence." So they were kind of estranged for most of that marriage. They finally divorced 5 years after. So close to, I think, 1929. Sorry, math. Good news for Sonya. She remarries, moves to California, and has a successful business career, dying of old age, really, in 1974. So this leaves us with the last portion of Lovecraft's life, what I call his autumn years. He's now alone, romping around in Providence. His writing's not really going anywhere. He's not publishing as much. He's writing longer fiction like the Call of Cthulhu, or no, I'm sorry, not the Call of Cthulhu, The Shadow over Innsmouth, The Whisperer in the Dark. These two really long novellas don't get picked up. They are not well received. They're a little experimental in form from what he was doing. So he finds a lot of work being a ghostwriter. He engages with banter with a few other major writers. Longfellow is one of his friends, not Longfellow. Long is his friend, who always writes fiction to him. He has like sycophants. He's really close to Clark Ashton Smith, as you can see in some of his letters. He gushes. He's a fanboy about Clark Ashton Smith. This is the time where he sees his aunts die as well. This is where he has a weird sort of month-long tryst with some 18-year-old down. This is a recently discovered an 18-year-old writer who lived with his parents down in Florida. Some critics argue that this was romantic. There's no way to say yay or nay on that. Lovecraft was pretty much not diverse, so I don't even think if it was a homosocial bond, he would open up about it. So we can't really go down that road. We do know that he left most of his writing rights, so his rights to his works to that man down in Florida. Eventually, August Derleth and Donald Wandrey pick up his work after Lovecraft's death in 1937. Lovecraft was admitted to Brown Hospital after stomach pain and died shortly thereafter. So Derleth and Wandrey pick up his work, cobble it all together, cobble all his letters. In fact, the edition of the letters that I scanned for you is a Derleth scanning, so that comes from Arkham House. They build Arkham House Publishing and spread his work internationally. So really the reason why we can have this course today and talk about Lovecraft is because of people like August Derleth and Donald Wandrey, who built the publishing house, who then published his work, collected it into novels. This is how we have scholars like Joshi, myself, editions like the Penguin edition, where he has now been, H.P. Lovecraft has been canonized. So his life is rather short, kind of sad when you think about it, if you really dive into his biography. There's a great collection, if you're interested, his biography and letters. If you want to check that out down the road, I'm not going to make you read that. That I think will help color his life a bit more for you if you're interested afterwards. But these are the major hits: death of father, death of mother, marriage to Sonya Green, eventual death. It's good to know that he didn't reach popularity much at all through his life. He was a ghostwriter mostly, which meant he wrote for other people. That's how he made his money. It was only after his death that he became a name, which is kind of sad, but alas, the way it goes. So that's my brief Cliff Note version of his bio. Check out his letters. They are really fun. You are able to close read those letters as texts if you want to for your first paper assignment, which I'll type up and send out to you guys before next week. What you got to do this week, if you haven't already, read Thacker's Theory. Read Lovecraft's letters and his short story Dagon. Again, this was published in 1917 and is one of his favorites. Watch Fear of the Unknown. This is the documentary of Lovecraft's life and influence over current writers and filmmakers. In fact, some of the directors that are going to be in that video, we're watching. So it's going to be fun. You got to post by Wednesday at midnight, 700 words within the class forum. Remember, it's just responding to one of the green questions that I have throughout this lecture. You take the quiz that I have typed, short 5-question quiz. We went over all the answers, and they're mostly short answer, one true or false. By Thursday, and then respond to a classmate's post. Only one. I want to clarify this. You only have to respond to one person's post. Respond to a classmate's post, about 300 words by Friday at midnight. There is a bonus reading that I have up there if you haven't had enough. You can read over Lovecraft's long essay about horror. This is Fishman. This is Lovecraft's supernatural horror in literature. It's long. It's a slog. You can get away with only reading the first section and never reading the rest of it. Don't tell that to any of my critical friends. But that is where the quote for our class comes from. So if you're interested in seeing more and pairing how Lovecraft thinks about supernatural or speculative fiction and how that relates to Thacker, there is no better resource than supernatural horror in literature. But again, I'm not going to make you read that slog. It was hard enough to get through it myself. But I'm underselling it. It's a decent read. So if you have any questions going forward, qualms, queries, protestations, dear God wise, please email me. Let me know what's going on. From there, I will post the next lecture Monday morning as we go into week 2. The readings will be available probably Sunday night if you want to look those over, and then the lecture will go live on Monday and we'll start next week. I hope you have fun with the readings. Again, let me know if anything comes up. Thanks, guys.